All right, diving right in, folks. We've got a pretty big topic on our plate today, something that's been making waves in the tech world and is about to hit us all head on here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a big one for sure, and especially timely as it rolls out next week.
Exactly. We're talking about Meta's Community Notes, which is their grand experiment with crowdsourced fact-checking.
And it's actually not entirely a new concept. It's kind of fascinating, right? They're drawing inspiration from something that's already been in play over on Twitter, or, well, X as it is now.
Oh, right. I remember hearing something about that. So are they, like, copying Twitter's homework, or?
Not exactly copying, but more like building upon it. The cool thing is they're using the same open source algorithms that Twitter, or X, has been using, meaning anyone can actually look at the code, see how it works, and even suggest improvements.
Oh, so it's like a community-built fact-checking machine then.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
But how does it actually work when you're, like, scrolling through your feed? Let's say I'm on Facebook and I see a post that seems, a little fishy.
Okay, so with community notes, you can flag that post and then suggest a note to go along with it, explaining why you think it's misleading.
Okay, makes sense. So then what? Does everyone just get to vote on whether they agree or disagree?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Other users do weigh in. They rate your note as either helpful or not helpful. But here's the catch, and this is where Meta's approach gets interesting. For a note to actually show up publicly,
It's not just a popularity contest.
right, it's not just about getting the most votes. It has to reach a consensus among users who typically disagree on other stuff. So, like, people who might not see eye to eye on other topics, they have to agree that your note is helpful.
So it's about bridging those divides and finding common ground on what constitutes accurate information.
Precisely. They're trying to get to the heart of whether a note is genuinely helpful or not.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like a checks and balances system built right in. But I'm curious, why is Meta jumping on this bandwagon now? I mean, they've been dealing with misinformation for years.
Yeah, and they've been under a lot of scrutiny for how they've handled it, right? So they've said they're trying to address concerns about bias in their platforms. That's a big one.
Sure, trying to appear more neutral.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, they're always talking about improving accuracy, making fact-checking more efficient and scalable. But, it's interesting to look at this within the broader context of what's happening in the tech world, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. There's a bigger picture here.
For sure. I mean, look at what's happening with other tech giants like OpenAI, the folks behind ChatGPT.
Right.
They're putting a lot of emphasis on this idea of intellectual freedom.
It's like a hands-off approach.
Right, like moving away from directly censoring content and shifting towards creating systems where users get to evaluate information for themselves.
So it's like empowering users to be more discerning.
Yeah, exactly, to think for themselves.
Okay, so is this a genuine shift towards neutrality on Meta's part? Or are there other motives at play? Because I'm sure some folks are going to be pretty cynical about this whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. And they have reason to be, right? I mean, Meta's faced a lot of criticism, especially from the Trump administration, for allegedly censoring conservative viewpoints.
Right. It became a whole political battleground.
Exactly. So there's definitely a question here about whether this is a genuine attempt to create a more balanced system or whether it's a strategic response to that kind of pressure.
Okay, so we've got this system, Community Notes. It sounds intriguing in theory, but the big question is, does it actually work? Like, is crowdsourcing really the answer to this massive problem of online misinformation?
Well, there's actually some promising research out there suggesting that it might be. Studies have shown that people tend to find these community notes more trustworthy compared to traditional fact checks from organizations. Those can sometimes feel a bit biased, right?
Yeah, like who are these experts anyway?
Hey, like who are they to tell us what's true? But with community notes, it feels more like getting a fact check from your neighbor, like someone you could actually have a conversation with.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. If you trust the source, you're more likely to take the information seriously.
Right, that relatability factor is huge. And, this greater trust, it seems to translate into real-world impact. There's evidence suggesting that community notes can actually reduce the spread of misinformation online. But, and this is a big but.
There's always a catch.
Always, right. There are some limitations, like I've seen those notes pop up, but often it feels like they're too late. By the time a note gets enough of that consensus to be displayed, the post has already gone viral, the damage is done.
It's like trying to close the barn door after the horse is bolted.
Yeah, exactly. It's a valid concern.
So, while it might be good at debunking things in the long run, it's not so great at stopping things from going viral in the first place.
Right, that speed is a real issue. And there's another statistic that's kind of worrying. One study found that only about 9% of suggested notes actually get enough consensus to be shown publicly.
Wow, only 9%. That's a tiny fraction. So what's the bottleneck here? Is it just not enough people participating, or is there something more going on?
It's probably a combination of factors, to be honest. Participation is definitely part of it, but there are deeper issues at play, too. Like, reaching consensus is tough, especially online, where everything is so polarized these days. And then there's the potential for manipulation, which is something we should definitely dig into. Manipulation, yeah, that's a big one, right? It's a valid concern, for sure. I mean, you can imagine if a group with a particular agenda wants to push a certain narrative, they could try to flood the system with misleading notes or even try to game the ratings somehow to make sure their notes are the ones people see.
So even with all these checks and balances, there's still a chance that the system could be, like, hijacked.
There's always that risk, unfortunately. But Meta has said they're aware of this and they're putting things in place to try to prevent it.
What kind of safeguards are we talking about?
Well, they've talked about using algorithms to detect any suspicious activity, like, if someone is suddenly creating a ton of notes or rating things in a really weird way. And they also have teams that are actually monitoring the system, looking for potential manipulation attempts. Plus, they're emphasizing transparency.
Transparency, huh? What does that actually mean in this context?
So with community notes, unlike some of those, black box algorithms out there, you can actually see who wrote each note, you can look at their history of ratings, and you can see what other users have said about their contributions.
So it's like a built-in accountability system.
Exactly. It's like, oh, this person has a history of pushing a certain agenda. Maybe I should take their note with a grain of salt.
Okay, so there's at least some level of, vetting going on. But I imagine it must be a constant battle for Meta to stay one step ahead of the manipulators.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a cat and mouse game for sure. As soon as they close one loophole, someone else might find another way to, work the system.
It makes you wonder if it's even worth the effort.
Yeah, it's a valid question. But I think, maybe this whole experiment with community notes, even with its flaws, it's pushing us in the right direction. It's forcing us all to think more critically about the information we encounter online.
It's like we're going from passively consuming whatever we see to actually questioning things, doing our own research. It's almost like we're all becoming citizen journalists in a way.
It's a pretty empowering way to think about it, right? Like, we all have a role to play in upholding the truth.
Totally. But, I have to say, not everyone is thrilled about this whole crowdsourced fact-checking thing. There are definitely some critics out there who worry it could backfire.
Yeah, there are definitely some valid concerns. Like, some people worry that by focusing so much on these individual fact checks, we might lose sight of the bigger picture.
Like we're getting bogged down in the weeds and missing the forest for the trees.
Exactly. Because addressing misinformation, it's not just about flagging individual posts, it's about tackling those underlying systems that allow misinformation to spread in the first place.
I see what you mean. So are they saying that community notes are just a distraction then? Like a way for Meta to appear to be doing something without actually addressing the root causes of the problem?
Well, that's a pretty harsh critique, but it's a perspective that's worth considering. Some critics argue that the real problem lies with things like the algorithms that these platforms use, the ones that prioritize engagement over accuracy.
Right. It's all about those clicks and shares.
Exactly. And then there's the lack of media literacy education, teaching people from a young age how to be critical thinkers, how to evaluate sources. Those are systemic issues that require much more than just a Band-Aid solution.
So you could see community notes as a Band-Aid, a temporary fix that doesn't really address the deeper problem.
It's a way of looking at it, for sure. But even if it's not a complete solution, wouldn't you say it's still a step in the right direction?
I mean, it has to be better than doing nothing, right?
Right. It's a big experiment, and the U.S. launch is a huge moment. It'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, it feels like a turning point in a way.
Yeah.
But let's bring this back to our listeners for a minute. For the average person scrolling through their Facebook feed or checking out stories on Instagram, what does all this actually mean for them? What should they be thinking about as they're consuming information online?
I think the biggest takeaway here, and it's something we can't emphasize enough, is that even with these systems in place, we all still need to be critical thinkers. We can't just blindly accept any information we see online, even if it has a community note attached to it.
So even if a post has been, quote unquote, fact-checked by the community, we still need to approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly. Remember, these notes are written by other users. They might have their own biases, their own agendas. So always do your own research, consider multiple perspectives, and be wary of anything that sounds too good to be true or that just confirms your existing beliefs.
It's like that old saying, right? Don't believe everything you read on the internet. It's more relevant now than ever. But beyond individual posts, I'm curious about the bigger picture here. Do you think community notes could actually change how we consume information online in the long run?
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I mean, with Meta going all in on this, it makes you wonder, are other platforms going to follow suit? Could this become the standard for how we handle misinformation online from now on?
It's definitely a possibility if it proves to be successful. I mean, other platforms, even news organizations, might start adopting similar systems. It really could open up a whole new world of possibilities.
But like we were saying earlier, there are always those unintended consequences, right? So what are some of the things that worry you about this whole shift towards crowdsourced fact-checking?
Well, one concern is that it could end up stifling dissenting opinions or alternative viewpoints, Right. If the majority gets to decide what's considered true or false or even misleading, it could create a situation where certain perspectives are kind of silenced or pushed to the margins. Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike, right? We want to fight misinformation, of course. We want to create a more trustworthy online environment. Yeah. But we also don't want to end up in an echo chamber where only certain viewpoints are allowed.
Exactly. That's the challenge. And that's why the design and the implementation of these systems is so crucial. Like, how do you make sure it's fair, that it's transparent, that it's resistant to manipulation? How do you protect freedom of speech while also, protecting people from harmful lies and falsehoods? Those are some pretty big questions that we all need to grapple with.
It feels like a huge responsibility, not just for Meta, but for all of us as users, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're being asked to step up and become more active participants in shaping the online information landscape.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just passively consume information anymore. We have to engage critically, question what we see, and demand transparency and accountability from these platforms that we're all using every day.
And it's not just about individual responsibility either, right? I mean, governments and regulators are starting to pay attention to this too. We're seeing more and more calls for legislation, for oversight to try to address the spread of misinformation and protect users.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look at the European Union. They've already taken some pretty big steps with their Digital Services Act, which is all about holding platforms accountable for illegal and harmful content. And even here in the U.S., there's growing bipartisan support for updating those antitrust laws to address the dominance of these tech giants.
It feels like we're entering a whole new era of digital governance, and it's going to be fascinating to watch how it all unfolds. I mean, the launch of Community Notes by Meta is just one piece of this much larger puzzle. It's a sign that the rules of the game are changing and the power dynamics are shifting in a big way.
Absolutely. It's a really dynamic situation, constantly evolving. And it's a conversation that we all need to be a part of. We have to keep asking those tough questions, consider all the different perspectives, and work towards solutions that create a more informed and more equitable online world for everyone.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Meta's Community Notes, let's leave our listeners with this thought. We're all part of this experiment now, whether we like it or not. The way we engage with information online, the choices we make as users, the pressure we put on these platforms, it all matters. It's all going to shape the future of how we consume and share information. So stay curious, stay critical, and stay engaged. And until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.